Okay, so here we are with Nancy White, and it's a big pleasure and honor to have you with us. And I know that you are a very experienced facilitator and virtual facilitator and liberating structure facilitator. And one thing that I like about you is that you spent some time in Brazil. And so I think you have a special feeling of we Brazilians and this kind of warm heart that you have. So thank you for joining us here.
Nada.
Do you want to say something, Fernanda?
Sim, eu fui estudante de intercâmbio de Rotary em São Paulo em 1964, 65. Então, faz muito tempo que eu não falo português e também tenho oportunidades de praticar em espanhol, então portanhol. It's a mess, but but you know it's fun because the other night I actually dreamed in Portuguese. I mean the whole dream was in Portuguese, and in the dream I understood it, so I know it's still in there in my head because it was a very full year, and I was dreaming in Portuguese after 3 months, so I knew that I understood the language. My conjugation of verbs may not have been perfect, but my conjugation of verbs in English is not perfect either. So I'm consistent in my poor conjugation of verbos.
Awesome.
I've been an independent practitioner since 1997, after 3 different careers in broadcasting on the back end side, maternal child health, and an internet startup. And the thread that kind of pulled it all together was working with people, working with groups, working in community. So not just a one-time shot with people, but also working with people over periods of time in a peer-to-peer way. So I've always been fascinated by what works when we gather together and what doesn't work when we gather together. And that keeps me curious. I live in Washington State, not Washington, DC. And our 2 grandchildren live with us. So I have a very, very busy life. There may be a knock on the door in my office. Who knows?
And they are welcome. Okay, so, and what is an awesome day for Nancy White?
An awesome day is not getting up at 4 a.m. to facilitate. It's, I think for me at age 62, an awesome day is a balance of work and family and garden and outdoors. But from a work perspective, it is connecting with people's intentions and finding our shared intentions and purpose, and then finding ways to do it and having some fun while you do it. My personal operating philosophy is do a little good every day, learn something every day, and have fun. And so a lot of things can manifest with those 3 things in a day. And I also like diversity. So I don't like every day to be the same. So a great day could be very diverse for me.
And I remember you debriefing the day with your granddaughters, asking her about what did they learn. And so yeah, it's nice to see these facilitation skills come into the family as well.
What's interesting you say facilitation skills, because I've really been thinking about the word facilitation, and I think I am moving away from, for sure, a classic definition of facilitation towards what are the ways that we choose to show up individually and collectively, and that things like liberating structures may be less about facilitation and more about how we exercise leadership, both individually and collectively. So it's interesting. I think I'm identifying less as a facilitator now. And, you know, if we bring those things to our personal life, our community life, to our work life, we aren't the facilitator, right? Anybody can help support that process. So I think for me, it's like, it's moving away from the traditional view of facilitator and some of the traditional values of facilitation, such as neutrality. I'm not convinced we can be neutral. I'm not convinced we should always be trying to be neutral. There are certain times when we're trying to keep out of people's opinions and support their process, but there's a lot of times when we're quote unquote facilitating where we are trying to move things towards a particular end, and that is not neutral.
Mm-hmm. And that's related with our role as facilitators. If you step in as the facilitator is one thing. If you step out and let the group work. So yeah.
I think we need a new term.
Yeah, probably.
Mm-hmm.
You'll be it will be a very polemic for sure.
Yeah.
So just piggyback on the polemic side of Nancy White. What do we mean by confusiasm?
So I mentioned that every day I want to learn something. Well, learning requires us to not know or to recognize our not knowing. So there are times when we are confused, where we don't know the answer, where we don't even know to look for the answer, but our enthusiasm towards the purpose or the learning allows us to hold that uncertainty or that ambiguity. So you can be both confused and enthusiastic at the same time. It's sort of like Sam Kainer's groan zone when you go from divergence to convergence. There's this moment when you're trying to do this stuff and it feels weird sometimes. Sometimes it actually feels awful. But if we can hold the intention of why we're going through that moment, then we get to the other side. And confusiasm is really helpful when you're in a rapidly changing and uncertain environment. I think the last 6 months with COVID, you know, I know you Canadians up there have, or your Brazilians who live in Canada have it better than most of us Americans, United Statians, or even Brazilians. And our ability to move forward without certainty is absolutely essential. So confusiasm, why not be enthusiastic about it, you know, instead of grumping and groaning?
Okay. And so one day you said that working with Liberating Structure is a different facilitation. So can you explain more about it?
Well, when you look at liberating structures at first glance, and if you're a facilitator, you can go, oh, I recognize that. Oh, that's World Cafe. Oh, that's open space. Things that we have done for many years that are familiar to us. And so at first glance, liberating structure looks like a nice way to organize all these useful processes, right? Mm-hmm. You may have heard the expression old wine in new bottles, and it's a great new bottle, right? So you could simply think of liberating structures that way, as a way to describe processes that you can use to suggest where and when they're useful. Then you go like, okay, but there's something else here, right? And that is the microstructures, and thinking about literally how we choose to organize our intentions, how power is distributed, how the room or the technology is organized, and how changes in those things change what happens in the room, right? And thus it becomes a pattern language. And you could then go way beyond the 33 plus structures and look at anything and see, how am I structuring it? So if there is a presentation to be made where someone controls the power from the front of the room, it is being conscious that that is what's happening can be useful, right? So it's our understanding of group process goes up, and our ability to improvise and adjust goes up, okay? So that's kind of the second, to me, thing that revealed itself to me with liberating structures. And I don't know why, maybe I was slow, but it took me a while to get it, okay? I'll admit it right here. The third, and what has become probably the driving reason I use liberating structures in my practice, is they are informed by and well adapted to complex situations. So if we go back to confusiasm, right? Mm-hmm. Where we don't know exactly what's going to happen, we want methods that allow us to do, say, fail experimentations to get us towards the next thing. We want something that helps us identify the compass point, even if we haven't figured out the map going there. We want things that help us not oversimplify things when they're complex. So things like critical uncertainties help us see something from a complexity view. EcoCycle helps us see it from both a complexity and a developmental view. So these become thinking tools as well as group process tools. And if I begin to apply them to what I'm doing at my desk right now, what we're doing in terms of schooling our kids, our grandkids online, what I'm doing in terms of my garden, there's all bits of information there that this pattern and these things that are well adapted to complexity can allow me to think differently and thus make choices and act more adaptively. And if anything has taught me anything, that this world needs ways to work that are adaptive and suitable for complex situations. It's not as, you know, we do A, then we do B, then we do C, and everything's done. There's not that much that we need to do. And people certainly aren't hiring consultants to do that. Companies aren't hiring internal consultants to do that. They're hiring people to do the messy stuff. Communities are looking towards leaders to do the messy stuff. So for me, this is really integral to why I think liberating structures are valuable.
Yeah, that's, we just get to some conclusions, or I can say conclusions, not conclusions, but we got what was underneath liberating structures because people like you and Fisher and Keith explaining, but it's hard to get this this second level. You
know, I think that's why it's important to learn about them in community. It's real easy to get good at the logistics of one of them, but if you don't debrief them with people who've had a different experience or people who've done them more than you do, you're not going to move that practice forward. So you can do everything from the instructions, and get good results. But the real magic happens when you begin to understand it at the deeper level. And then you can actually improvise and adapt. And when the people you're working with start getting those different levels, then all of a sudden they see it differently. They stop seeing it as a parlor trick. Oh, you just made it fun and therefore we got the work done. It's not a parlor trick, okay? It's not a performance. It is fundamentally rethinking and seeing and acting based on what you want to achieve. It really puts purpose at the center, not process, despite the fact that we're talking about process. Purpose is at the center.
Yeah, I can see this journey. It's not something that you just pick up and said, oh, as a tool, yes, but.
But then we would have been bored with it years ago and we would have been on to the next thing. You know, I don't stick with something that long unless it has good depth and layers and nuance and the ability to constantly learn more. I mean, I think that's what's terrific for me about practicing with you and other practitioners is that when I look at a structure through someone else's eyes, I see something new that's possible. And it's not like I have to accept all those views, but to understand they're there, then it changes how I bring it to a room.
And can you tell us, how did you get to the liberating structures? Did you bump to Keith on a road?
On the street?
Well, Keith and I met in 2008 when we were both doing graphic recording when the Dalai Lama came to Seattle. And we were put into a team. And I was a fairly new practitioner in the skill of graphic recording. And you know, I don't know what you are and aren't supposed to do. I was never very good about following the rules. Let me just, I was good to a point and then I'm terrible. And so we put up the paper and he goes like, well, where's your paper? And I'm going like, aren't we drawing together? And this guy looks at me and goes like, so he had me draw a chair. This is kind of the test. And I drew a chair with wings and he looked at me and says, we'll be fine. So a few years later, I get a phone call from Keith and he says, can I bring over a box of chocolates, a bottle of wine, and the stuff I'm writing? I'd like you to take a look at a few chapters. And he brought over some of the pages of one of the early drafts of the book. And of course, oh God, I don't know why Keith didn't just abandon me as a friend right there. But basically I said, this is a beautiful packaging. I was saying old wine in new bottles. Because that was as far as I understood. And Keith would keep inviting me to immersions and he'd start giving me jobs at immersions. I'm going like, I don't know what this is. And it was only through that exposure in practice and the variation of exposure in practice that I began to really understand the vitality of the microstructures and the patterns underneath it. And you know, some of the ways that I do liberating structures are very different than he does. frankly, there was a couple of them when he did them, I couldn't get them. I didn't understand them. But when someone else did them, I all of a sudden understood them. So, you know, it's really interesting. I used to ignore eco-cycle, for example, and now I think it's a central part of my practice, not as a method, but as a fundamental thinking and doing tool. That's a journey.
Yeah, and luckily you're very close.
And yeah, and I like to think about, like in Brazil, we have a big group practicing together, and this collective work that happens when people are doing liberating structures together. So it's good to hear that you said that, and to see what's happening in all over the world, but in Brazil. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's the only way to get past the mechanical practice.
Yeah, that's my other question for you. How can you help people step into this debriefing part, looking what is underneath, or what the changes happening? What are the changes happening in your way of thinking? How can you help people to get deeper on this perspective?
Well, I think the first layer is to be able to name and call out the microstructures. And then the next thing is what if you tweaked this microstructure? What would happen differently? Okay, because it's one thing to understand the microstructures conceptually. It's another to say, okay, so if we were doing pairs, what happens when we put them in trios? So this is a classic example that's come up as we've moved offline practices to online, and where we have people who have connectivity problems. When we put people in pairs, we do run a risk in certain contexts of having one person alone because one person dropped out. But when you add 3 people, something changes, right? So you have to understand what changes and understand, am I going to take the risk of getting people dropping off and I want to stick with 2? Do I adapt it to 3? And then that conversation is not just simply a random experiment. It's an experiment with what am I paying attention to as we run the experiment. Okay, so I find debriefing with people, I learned from people who had more experience than me. It's like, but I can learn from people who have less experience than me, absolutely, and people who I think were at a similar level. But early on, it's nice to have an experienced practitioner say, well, what just happened there? And I have to answer, what just happened there? I don't know, but it was really cool, is not a sufficient answer. Okay. And once you kind of cross that bridge, then you can start, as riffing and improvising. And as you know, we have some colleagues who I swear never do anything the same twice, but they do it with an intentionality, not just a frivolous, oh, what happens if we do this? And one of the things that I sort of evaluate someone's maturity of their practice is if they're improvising, they know why they're improvising, instead of just, oh, this is fun, let's try this. Because fun, try this is fun, right? But if you aren't discerning why you're making that adaptation and you're not watching for what's different, then you're not going to take your practice deeper. But, which is fine. Not everybody wants a deep practice, frankly. Not everybody wants to think about it. And that's fine too. I like to think about it.
What unexpected surprise did you find with liberating structures?
Well, one that challenges me is how different people perceive time. And liberating structures is often described as processes that move really fast, right? 2 minutes for this, 4 minutes for that. And I was initially taught, don't give in, keep to the time, push them through, there's a reason for it. And I think it's particularly challenging because that assumption does not cross all cultural and personal boundaries the same. Therefore, we may be privileging people who think quickly through talking in many of the structures, which is why I love some of the ones that are physical or have visual aspects to them, or allow for more of that individual time versus joint processing. So I think a challenging experience is when people challenge the orthodoxy of liberating structures, and I really have to listen to what they're saying and seek to understand what they're experiencing or saying, because I don't think, I would hesitate to say always, you should always do it this way and no changes, right? So that's one. The other thing that's happened that's just absolutely joyful is when somebody leaves, let's say a workshop, a 2-day immersion. Here's a woman who left after 1 day and immediately went and changed how she was teaching this field research course in Francophone Africa. Like immediately, she changed everything. Another woman who said, I've just found what it is I want to do. Now I have to figure out how to do it within my organization, but I'm not going to go back to the old way, okay? Because there's something about when you have that experience where the people around you get done what they want to get done and they own it, that is so much more satisfying than simply taking them through a process, right? This is to me that distinction between facilitation and something else. Sometimes you're just bearing witness to their work. You're not facilitating, you're giving them some instructions and you're bearing witness to their work. Other times you're challenging them. You know, no, you're not going deep enough. Go harder, go bolder. You know, you are, you're coaching them and cheerleading them. Other times you are like their confessor or their, you know, I know this is like totally against facilitation principles, but sometimes you're their counselor. You're their ear. You're their place to try things out because you have created that invitation and people say yes to it. And they say yes to it more than just getting the task done. They're all in. And when that happens, the room changes. Doesn't always happen, okay? But when it does happen, possibility becomes much sharper and people can go like, we can do that. Yeah, we can do that. And we own that. We created that. Someone else didn't lay it on our lap and ask us to rubber stamp it, okay? That's good stuff.
Agreed.
Nice. Nancy, have you worked with some partner for a long time or very often? That's a very close question, just to check with you.
I work with quite a few people, but what's been really interesting to me in the COVID era is you do not do online stuff by yourself, okay? Most of my clients are were in international development or nonprofits, and they can't afford 2 facilitators, okay? I almost always worked alone except for very big events, right? And sometimes I did big events by myself because I could do it and that's what the client needed. In the COVID era, I've gotten to work with a handful of new people, or they're not new to me, but the kind of intense work, and it's super wonderful. I just can't believe I've gotten really lucky about, because sometimes I ask people to join me who I don't know that much about. I just going on a hunch and I've gotten lucky. But working in a partnership has been very satisfying, and it's going to be hard to go back face to face if I'm back in solo land, because, you know, they're not paying for hotels, they're not paying for airplanes, so you're going to pay for 2 facilitators.
Sure.
Nice. So we have 2 more questions here. One, it's why do you help to spread liberated structures all over the world? Why is that important for you?
Well, I believe in communities of practice and social learning, first of all. Before Liberating Structures, this has been a part of my practice. If we don't work and learn with and from each other, we're cheating ourselves and we're cheating other people. So there's a fundamental value that comes before the Liberating Structures. The second is that thing we've talked about before, is there's lots of layers and subtleties about liberating structures, and only doing and learning them together can we discover those. And then finally, this is a very concrete one, is I don't want to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning to do meetings in Africa, okay? I want someone in Africa to do those meetings. I want someone who is local and contextually embedded, not some white woman, old woman from the west of North America, right? To me, hiring locally has huge value. I understand why you bring in an international consultant. I understand why you can't be a prophet in your own land, but the need for this capacity is so great. We need to have more practitioners. And it's not, there's an abundance of need and an abundance of work. So let's, bring along, particularly I'm desperately looking for younger practitioners and practitioners of color and practitioners working in different languages, because I get calls go like, can you facilitate this meeting in Nairobi? And I'm going, yeah, but I'm not going to. You should talk to so-and-so or so-and-so, right? Mm-hmm. That's where we need to go. And I'm at the point in my life, I'm 62, I can do that. I don't have to worry about where my next meal is coming from. So it's also easier for me from an economic standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so, and we have one here, it's more philosophical, maybe?
To close, yeah, to wrap up this first part.
To wrap up all of that, and so just what we are living these days. So what do you see or hope to see in the future for humanity?
I have to be very careful not to get immediate and political. Please give me a different president. Yeah. I hope that we can find our way to thinking about the importance of community and collective interest, not just individual interest. That we can listen and hear each other rather than continue moving into very polarized ways of being in the world, because I know my country's not the only country facing this. Mm-hmm. And if we just look out for self-interest, everything's coming crashing around. I mean, I look at the smoke that's enveloping my state right now from the forest fires on the West Coast. I look at the people who are out of jobs because of COVID, who are dying because of COVID. We can do better than we've done. I know our country can do better, but as a globe, if we feel that interconnectedness, not as a defensive or an avaricious way of making money perspective, I think we can do better.
Beautiful.
Me too. Yeah, it's the hope.
Yeah.
Oh, got to have some hope. Nossa Senhora.
Nossa Senhora.
Senhora.
There is another one that is good. Vish.
Otherwise, it's a total bagunza. Okay, sounds good.
Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, ciao, ciao.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao.